Hi, Ben Phillips here, and welcome back to my final video in this Prayer Book 101 series. This is the 106 video, which is the liturgical calendar revisited, where we're going to specifically look at figuring out the prayers and the lessons and how to determine prayer book use for the seasons of Epiphany and Pentecost. So we're going to revisit the liturgical calendar to get into some things that require a little more detail than what I was able to cover in my earlier video, the 103 video, Understanding the Church Year. So let's jump right in and start talking about the liturgical calendar. And then we're going to look at each of the two seasons, first Epiphany and then Pentecost. Epiphany is a little simpler to figure out than Pentecost, so we'll start there. So let's just jump right in. If you recall, the liturgical calendar is connected to the standard calendar at a number of fixed points. For example, Christmas Day is always on December 25th, no matter what day of the week it falls on. It's always on December 25th. The same is also true of Epiphany. That will always be on January 6th, no matter what day of the week that falls. Other dates like All Saints' Day are always on November 1st, no matter what day of the week they're on. However, there are other feasts and observances of the liturgical calendar that are movable, the most notable of which and most significant in its impact on the church year is Easter. You may recall that Easter is the first Sunday following the full moon, which occurs after the spring equinox. And so those astronomical features will make the time or the date of Easter flex. It can be anywhere from March 22nd to April 25th. And so because the seasons before Christmas and Easter are also fixed, in other words, Advent is always 4 Sundays, and Lent is always 6 Sundays. If Easter moves up, then other seasons of the church year have to flex in order to account for and to keep Lent and Advent the same number of Sundays year to year. And so the seasons that flex are Epiphany and Pentecost. Epiphany and Pentecost are referred to as ordinary time, and they are the seasons that run anywhere, in the case of Epiphany, from 4 Sundays to 9 Sundays, or in the case of Pentecost, from 22 to 29 Sundays. What I'm going to teach you in this video is how to figure out which proper to use for which Sunday in Epiphany or in the season of Pentecost. A proper is the collect, the preface for communion, and the lessons that are assigned to a particular Sunday in the year or in the church season or to another feast day. The propers are defined as the part of the liturgy that changes week to week depending on the season or the week of the year, as opposed to other parts of the liturgy that are always the same no matter where you are in the church year. So in Epiphany, in the season of Epiphany, it will always start the same way and will skip or omit the later propers in order to always end on what we call the last Sunday of Epiphany. Pentecost works sort of the opposite, that Pentecost will omit earlier propers in order to always finish on the last Sunday of Pentecost. As we're going about doing our work figuring out Epiphany and Pentecost, one of the things that's going to be very helpful for you as you're following along at home is to be able to look at the collects of the church year. One of the best ways to see the church year laid out is by following along in your prayer book with the collects. The collects are the prayers that are assigned for each Sunday of the church year or for other feast days or observances in the church year. The traditional collects begin on page 159, and the what we call contemporary collects start on page 211. So whichever you prefer, the traditional language or the contemporary language, but the collects themselves are essentially the same. They always start on the first Sunday of Advent, and you can turn page by page and just see as the Sundays progress from one to the next through the church year. And what you'll discover as you begin to turn through these pages is that you'll get to the season of Epiphany, And you'll see that there are upwards of 9 Sundays or 9 collects in Epiphany. So how many do you use? If you keep on turning, you'll come to Ash Wednesday, and then through the Sundays in Lent, and then Holy Week, and then into Eastertide, and then through Easter, and including Ascension Day until you get to the Feast of Pentecost, also called Whit Sunday, so named because people were often baptized on Pentecost and were required to wear white robes when they were baptized, and so that why in England it was referred to as Whit Sunday. And then following Pentecost is Trinity Sunday. That's the first Sunday following Pentecost. So you can turn page by page through the church year very easily in the collect section, and that may be a very helpful tool for you as I'm leading you through this exploration of figuring out Epiphany and Pentecost. In the Book of Common Prayer, the Sundays in Epiphany are referred to by name. For example, the 3rd Sunday after the Epiphany, the 6th Sunday after the Epiphany, and so forth. Whereas in the season of Pentecost, in the prayer book, they are referred to as propers with a capital P. For example, Proper 8 or Proper 23. And so our task will be to figure out which propers to start with and begin assigning to the Sundays after the Feast of Pentecost. Our first task is to figure out how many Sundays there are in each of these seasons. There's a great table on page 884 and 885 that very few people know about, and it's a wonderful gem in your prayer book. So if we turn to that table, it's called A Table to Find Movable Feasts and Holy Days, and what it will tell you is based on the date of Easter, it will tell you how many Sundays are after Epiphany. It will tell you what date Ash Wednesday will fall on. It tells you what date Ascension Day will fall on. And if you recall, Ascension is always on a Thursday. It's 40 days after Easter. It will also tell you what the date of the Feast of Pentecost is. Remember, Pentecost is 50 days from Easter. And it will also tell you what number proper to start the sequence of propers for the season of Pentecost on. And then it will also tell you the date of the first Sunday of Advent. So it is an incredibly helpful table for figuring out pretty much the entire liturgical calendar. So in this year, in 2020, we know that Easter was on April 12th. So if we look in our table, we'll track along to April 12th and find that, and that will actually be on page 885. And according to the table, that tells us that there are 7 Sundays after Epiphany, that Ash Wednesday will be on February 25th, that Ascension Day will be on May 21st, and that the Feast of Pentecost will be on May 31st, and that we're supposed to start with the proper number 6. And I'll get into that in just a little bit in my next section of this video. And that the first Sunday of Advent is on November 29th. So this table will tell us exactly how many Sundays are in Epiphany, and it will tell us where to start our propers on the 2nd Sunday of Pentecost. So let's begin to apply this now, first to the season of Epiphany, and then we'll apply it also to the season of Pentecost. So let's start talking about the season of Epiphany. As you recall, if Easter is early, then Epiphany will get shorter by a few weeks, and Pentecost will get longer. Or if Easter is later, say in mid-April, then the season of Epiphany will have a few more Sundays in it, and the season of Pentecost will get a little bit shorter by a few Sundays. Epiphany always falls on January 6th. No matter what day of the week, it's always on January 6th. And the Sunday immediately following that, the first Sunday after the Epiphany, is always observed as the baptism of our Lord. And that can be found in your prayer book on page 214 for the contemporary collects, or on page 163 for the traditional. So Epiphany is always on January 6th, And then the season of Epiphany always starts with the baptism of our Lord on the first Sunday after the Epiphany. And then the season of Epiphany ends with what we call the last Sunday after the Epiphany. These characteristics of the season of Epiphany mirror what we see also in the season of Pentecost. The season of Pentecost starts with the Feast of Pentecost. The first Sunday after that is always called Trinity Sunday. And then the last Sunday of the season is called the last Sunday after Pentecost, or sometimes also called the Feast or the Sunday of Christ the King. So in that sense, the baptism of our Lord parallels Trinity Sunday, and the last Sunday of Epiphany parallels Christ the King, or the last Sunday after Pentecost. So that may help you conceptualize how these seasons work. And then the Sundays in the middle of these seasons are the ones that flex and are omitted depending on how short or long the season needs to be. So think of baptism of our Lord, last Sunday of Epiphany, or Trinity Sunday, and the last Sunday of Pentecost, Christ the King, as the bookends within that season. So in the year 2020, as we looked up on our table, there are 7 Sundays after Epiphany. The Sundays start consecutively from Epiphany 1 and run through to Epiphany 6. Then on the 7th and final Sunday in the season, the proper used is for the last Sunday after the Epiphany, which is on page 165 for the collect, or on page 217 for the contemporary collect. But we don't use the proper for the 7th Sunday of Epiphany. We use the proper for the last Sunday after the Epiphany. So the propers for the 7th Sunday and 8th Sunday of Epiphany are the ones that are then omitted. So there are 7 Sundays in the season of Epiphany. We start with the baptism of our Lord on the first Sunday after the Epiphany. We run through up to the 6th Sunday of Epiphany, and then we use the last Sunday of Epiphany on the 7th week. And then we omit the propers for Epiphany 7 and 8. So let's look at that in a little more concrete terms from our actual calendar from 2020. So January 6th, the Feast of Epiphany fell on a Monday this year. That following Sunday was January 12th. That's the first Sunday after Epiphany, also known as the baptism of our Lord, when we remember and celebrate that Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. The second Sunday after the Epiphany was then on January 19th, and then we sequentially run through the third Sunday after Epiphany, fourth Sunday after Epiphany, and so forth, until we get to February 15th, which is the sixth Sunday after Epiphany. And then on February 22nd, which would be the seventh Sunday after the Epiphany, we don't use the proper for seventh Sunday. We use the last Sunday after the Epiphany, because that is in fact the last Sunday of the season, because then that Wednesday is Ash Wednesday and the start of the season of Lent. And then March 1st is the first Sunday in Lent. And if you look in your prayer book at the instructions for the last Sunday after the Epiphany, it says this proper is always used on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. So that's really the key indicator. Whatever Sunday is right before Ash Wednesday, that's going to be your last Sunday of Epiphany, and that will then replace whatever the sequential number would have been. In our case, Epiphany 7, and then any other propers are just omitted as we go into the season of Lent. Now we're going to move forward into our study of the season of Pentecost. Recall that if Easter falls early, that is in sometime in March, say, then Pentecost will be longer. And if Easter is later, say in April, then Pentecost will be shorter by a few weeks. So the question is how do we determine how many Sundays to omit as we're moving our way through the propers to figure out which collect to use and which lessons to select from either the daily office or from the lectionary? So looking at the season as a whole, the Feast of Pentecost, which falls 50 days after Easter, is then followed by the first Sunday after Pentecost, which is always Trinity Sunday. And then we move through the season until we get to the last season of Pentecost, which is sometimes also called Christ the King. Now, in the prayer book, the Sundays or the propers for the season of Pentecost are not given their own names like they are in Epiphany. They're simply called proper. Proper 1, proper 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and all the way up through to 29. So what we need to do is figure out which proper we start with after Trinity Sunday. So Pentecost always has its own designated propers. The first Sunday after Pentecost, that is Trinity Sunday, always has its own proper. But then when we get to the second Sunday after Pentecost, which proper do we use so that when we start moving sequentially through them, we will always end on proper 29. That's how Pentecost works. So again, we turn to the information in our table found on page 885, and that tells us that the proper we're to start with is proper 6. So proper 6 can be found on page 230 for the contemporary or page 178 for the traditional. And what that means then is that on the second Sunday of Pentecost, we will use proper 6. On the third Sunday after Pentecost, we would use proper 7, and so on and so forth, all the way through until we get to the last Sunday in Pentecost, where we'll use proper 29. Now note, in the prayer book, it is not referred to as Christ the King Sunday or the last Sunday of Pentecost. It's simply called proper 29. So if you're looking for that terminology, Christ the King or the last Sunday of Pentecost, it does not appear in the prayer book, at least in the collects. So that's how we determine our seasons of Pentecost. And if we're going to look at our own calendar or do a calendar example, we know that Easter was on April 12th. The Feast of Pentecost is on May 31st. And then 1 week later, on June 7th, is Trinity Sunday. And then the second Sunday after Pentecost is on June 14th. And for that Sunday, we would use proper 6 for both our collect and for the lessons. And then on June 21st, which is the third Sunday after Pentecost, we would use proper 7. And then so on through June and July. For the following Sundays after Pentecost, we would then use propers 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth until we get to the final Sunday in the season of Pentecost, which would be in November. And then following the use of proper 29, we would then start the year all over again at the end of November with the first Sunday of Advent. One of the things that you'll notice on the table on page 884 and 85 is that the proper that you start with following Pentecost, that is on the second Sunday of Pentecost, the earliest or the lowest number is proper 3. And so you're probably wondering, well, whatever happens to proper 1 and 2? And the answer is that proper 1 and 2 are used if you're doing services during the week or on a weekday following Pentecost or Trinity Sunday. So for example, if you're doing a service on a weekday following the Feast of Pentecost, you would use proper 1. If you're doing a service on a weekday following Trinity Sunday, you would use proper 2. When in doubt with any of this, you can always consult the website www.lectionarypage.net, and you could always call your minister if you're not sure, and we'd be happy to help you. This all may sound very complicated and esoteric, but trust me, if you spend a little bit of time working with it, following along on Sundays and trying to figure this out for yourself, you'll see that there is a very clear internal logic to it, and that with just a few weeks of practice, you'll start to figure out how this system works and how to find and look up the collect and the lessons for yourself for these seasons of Epiphany and Pentecost. And I'm hoping this video is very timely because we are fast approaching in 2020 the Feast of Pentecost in just a few weeks. And so if you're starting to use this video and to doing morning or evening prayer for yourself in just a few weeks, you'll find this video hopefully very helpful in figuring out which propers to use throughout the season of Pentecost. So thanks so much for being here with me as I've taken you through this introductory journey into the prayer book for our Prayer Book 101 series. I hope you'll find it very helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in additional videos as we continue to explore the rich liturgical tradition of the Anglican and the Episcopal Church. Thanks so much.